Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webcast today. And thank you to Yasmin and the crew at O'Reilly for running this show. Really appreciate all the work they've done. So I'm going to talk to you today about how you can bring a greater user experience design perspective to your projects. The technique I present is built for methods like Lean Startup in particular, but you can really use it for other project management methods as well. I gave a similar talk last night to a small meetup group in my hometown, and then we ended up talking for over 2 hours about it. So it's really great for me that people are so interested in this topic. And I'm excited to hear your comments and questions today. Before we get into the presentation, I want to tell you a little bit more about my book. It's called Why We Fail: Lessons from Experienced Design Failures. And I spent the past 2 years researching and writing it, and it was just published 2 weeks ago. In it are 10 case studies of products like Google Wave, Microsoft Zune, BMW's iDrive, and I explain how and why they failed, in my opinion, based on my research, and why they failed in particular to give people a good experience, and what I think we can do to avoid those same kind of failures. So everything you hear today is from the book. So you can buy the book in digital form in a number of formats from the O'Reilly store at the URL you see here. Or if you prefer a paperback, you can buy it from the Rosenfeld Media store at the URL, and you can be sure to use this discount code to get 20% off. And if you want to see this information, I'll repeat it again at the end of the talk. But let's get into the meat of our presentation here. So my goal here is to help you avoid failure. And in particular, it's also to get better at Lean, to enhance the Lean startup method a little bit, just to inject more of a user experience design perspective there to ask better questions, to come up with better hypotheses that you can test and avoid failure. So at the end, I'm going to try to boil everything down just to 4 simple questions you can ask, whether, like I said, whether you're doing Lean or not, to determine what you should test in your products, whether it's a large project, a small product, or even just a new feature, to decide what to test and how to mitigate risk, essentially. To tell you a little bit about, I probably will skip the About Me section because Yasmin already told you about myself. Talk about why design and experience are 2 different things. We should start thinking about them differently. A little bit of explanation of why we failed in giving people great customer experiences. Some patterns of failure I found, and improving how we use Lean. So let me jump right into this. So one important philosophical point I wanted to make that I ground the whole book in is that design is not equal to experience. And by that I mean we throw around this term user experience a lot to describe our work and our community of people who design digital things like websites or consumer electronics. But of course we're not actually designing someone's experience. Their experience is their thoughts, their emotions, their actions. And they take the products and services that we build and they have an experience with them. So we have some influence over their experience, but we're not really designing experience. We're just facilitating it. And what I found in my research is, this can sound like somewhat academic point here is very important in practice because as our products start becoming very complex, it's more important that we turn our attention not just from the design of the product, but to the experience people are having with it in order to avoid failure. So I think in the past, products have traditionally been judged by their performance. So I'll give you an example. Something like the Sony Walkman. It's very popular in its day and was really revolutionary in many ways. It had reduced a cassette player to the point where it was not only portable, it was wearable. It had great sound, sound as good as much larger devices, and it was affordable. So it kind of changed the way we listen to music. But our experience of the Walkman was still mostly about our music. The device itself was pretty simple. We didn't have a lot of rich experiences with the device. We just kind of popped our cassette in and pushed play, and then it was all about us listening to music. These days, we're not concerned so much about the performance as much because we have an excess of performance. If you think about the smartphones we have with us, they're these amazing little computers that most of the time have more processor power and memory and pixels than we can use. As opposed to 10 years ago, we would often talk about computers in terms of screen resolution and processor speeds because we're always waiting for the computer to catch up with us. And so always having something faster and better from a performance point of view was important. Now I think we have so much performance at our fingertips. Most of the time the device is waiting for us to do something, and we judge products differently. For example, if you think about these two smartphones, they have different screen sizes, and you might ask, well, is the bigger screen better? For some people, I'm sure it is. They prefer the bigger screen so they can look at more stuff on the screen or watch movies at a larger size. But other people might prefer a smaller device, so maybe they can slip it in their pocket or it's lighter. So it's really hard to say objectively, based on the specifications of the device, which one is better. The devices we have these days, they're very complex. There's much more complexity to a smartphone, say, compared to the Walkman. The basis on which we judge these devices are multifaceted. There's the screen size, the way the software is designed, the apps that are available, the whole ecosystem around the device. So there's many facets by which we judge it compared to something like the Walkman. And so this ends up being subjective. Whether I like a big screen or the way the icons look or the way the apps behave is largely a matter of personal preference. You may be familiar with the blog TechCrunch, which covers the startup industry. And they named this phenomenon the death of the spec, meaning at some point we've passed this threshold where specifications were no longer as important as our experience of the device. And you can start to see this happen in the way that companies describe their devices. They're no longer touting processor speeds and number of pixels anymore. They talk about what you can do with the devices and how they make you feel and what they enable you to do. So in the book, I trace the evolution of some devices through time and talk about how they, at some point, cross this threshold where they become more experiential and less about performance. So for example, something like phones, when you went from landline phone to mobile phone, you had a lot more features, and it was starting to become a little more experiential, but it still was a lot about what features it had and what it, could it be as good as a landline phone, and it's sort of catching up to the landline phone. But when we've got to the point where we have smartphones with touch screens, I think we've crossed that threshold where it's so much more than a phone, and we're experiencing differently. Our experience is much more rich than it was in the past. I'm just going to keep kind of driving this concept home a bit because to some of this might be familiar, but because we talk about experience as just another word for design, I want to really illustrate the difference here. So design, in my opinion, is, for example, I made a video years ago about the Microsoft toolbar in Microsoft Office because I thought this was so interesting that they had combined menus with a toolbar. It was a new look at how to create toolbars, and so I focused a video on that just to illustrate what was happening to other user interface designers. But this is really all about design, as opposed to if you do something like usability testing, you don't necessarily need to focus all the time on what is actually happening on the screen. You really want to also look at people's experience of what's happening. Are they surprised? Are they excited? Are they having fun? Are they frustrated? And that experience is very important when testing products. And in the past, a lot of what we tested was usability. whether you could use something or not. And what I found in my research is I think it's time with these complex products to go beyond just testing usability, but measuring experience. I can start to see this happening in other industries as well. So, for example, in the automotive industry, the focus has always been on, say, styling and performance numbers. And I see, both from a journalist point of view and from a user's point of view, that we're starting to think about these things differently. So, for example, there's a whole genre of videos on YouTube that consist of a dash cam on a car pointed at the passenger while a race car driver takes them around a racetrack. And so in these videos, you don't necessarily know what kind of car they're driving or where they are, what the racetrack looks like, anything about the situation other than the person's experience. In this video in particular, the woman in the passenger seat has these wonderful ecstatic emotions. She's afraid, she's excited, she's happy and screaming and laughing and alternately, and it's really wonderful to watch just her experience, and it's a different way of thinking about her experience of the automobile. On the journalist side, I can see this happening as well in publications like Motor Trend, which traditionally have always measured things like 0 to 60 times of acceleration, or how fast a car brakes or turns around a corner. But now publications, this is an example from Motor Trend in particular, who had always had a Car of the Year contest. They've started to put more emphasis on a different contest they call the Driver's Car of the Year, the best driver's car. And what they mean by that is, what car gives you the best experience to drive? And what was interesting last year is that this car, which was a joint project of Subaru and Toyota, it's called the Subaru BRZ. It's a modest little sports car, cost $28,000 in US dollars. This managed to come in fourth out of a group of 10 cars. And in the past, just based on performance, this probably wouldn't even have made it into the group because it's not as fast as other cars. And it doesn't have those outright performance qualities. But they just felt like it just felt so good to drive. This deserved to be in the contest and actually did very well. And placing fourth meant it placed higher than this $84,000 Jaguar, higher than this $295,000 McLaren, and higher than this $393,000 Lamborghini, which is saying a lot for a publication like Motor Trend, that this automotive tour de force that is the Lamborghini came in this contest at a lower place than the $28,000 Subaru. So it's really refreshing as I start to grab examples from other industries that are also coming to a similar conclusion, that they're looking beyond performance when we have an excess of performance to think that there's, we need to start judging things differently because, in terms of cars, we have more horsepower than we need. The radio gets most louder than I need it. It's very safe, and it's gotten to the point where we can eat and talk on the phone and drive all at the same time, whether that's good or not. But the cars are so refined, it's less about performance and more about our experience of the car. And increasingly, I think this is starting to become true of really important stuff too. So we're seeing a lot more technology enter doctors' offices, for example. So there's sites like ZocDoc, which let you communicate and make appointments online with your doctor. And I know personally, I'm at the point where I can make an appointment with my doctor, communicate with her online, follow up after the visit. She sends my prescriptions electronically to my pharmacy. And so all these things, and even paying the bill to my insurance company, all have been facilitated by technology. And if these things start to fail, then it's going to be more than just an inconvenience in terms of my experience. It's starting to become a matter of life and death. And I had this experience last year where it was, I think a little more than an inconvenience, where I had a minor surgery, just an outpatient procedure. So I had a surgery in the morning and then went home, and my wife went to go pick up a prescription for me. And instead of making the prescription out to Victor Lombardi, my name, it was made out to the name of the famous football coach, which sounds like me, Vince Lombardi. So I couldn't get my prescription for painkillers, which after the surgery I really needed. And this was kind of drew my attention to just the way that the technology could fail and how important it is. Okay, so why do we fail? Let me tell you a story about two social network websites, one of which I do a case study of in the book. So I won't reveal the names just yet, but let me describe them to you and see if you can guess what they are. So social network number one had a great design, especially for its time, just in terms of typography and the sophistication of the layouts, the colors, the textures on the page, the usability. It was very good. Social network number two, it was usable, but it wasn't really a great design. It was sort of just good enough to not to be unpleasant or unusable, but nothing beyond that. Social network number one had a lot of great features. Let you do microblogging, which isn't a term we use as much anymore, but let you write short messages. You could send them to everyone you're connected to or just a group of people. You could include attachments to your short messages. You could publicize events, so you could create a calendar event and essentially invite people to it using your short message. Your messages could appear as threaded conversations, so rather than just a large stream of messages, you could follow a conversation as people replied to you. And there were visual themes, so if you wanted to just choose something that expressed yourself or brand it for your company, you could do that. And social network number one also had very good uptime. They were a startup, and they had their occasional times when they had to bring their servers down for maintenance. But in general, they were careful to always be stable service. Social network number two, on the other hand, also let you do microblogging to send short messages, but had none of these other features. And their uptime was actually pretty horrible. It got to the point where they were infamous for going down all the time. So at this point, you might guess at least who social network number two is. That's Twitter, which years ago looked like this. So again, not a horrible design, but nothing like the Twitter we know today. And social network number one, which I profile in the book, is Pownce. So Pownce was one of a number of competitors that existed a few years ago when microblogging was young, and was really pioneering in a lot of the interaction design conventions that we know today. And a lot of things that they pioneered back then, Twitter ended up adding over time. And so it was interesting to me that Twitter came out of the gate with a richer feature set and a more attractive design than Twitter, and did get a lot of customers right off the bat, but ultimately just failed to compete with Twitter. And so that was something that spurred me to look deeper into this to really understand why did Twitter end up beating Pownce, which on the surface looks like a much better product. So going back to my chart, I added a few rows here at the bottom to show what I found. One thing that contributed to this was that Twitter had added the ability to send messages from SMS, to send text messages from your phone very early on, and supported mobile in a number of ways. So no matter where you were or what device you had, you could always send a message. And so they ended up attracting a lot of people who could send a lot more messages because they didn't have to be in front of their computer all the time. They also developed an API, an application program interface, so that other services could tie their applications into Twitter. So you could be in another program that worked on, say, your laptop and send a message there. And that's actually what you can see today through this Webcast software is, they built a little widget that allows you to send a tweet from there into Twitter system. So that was another way they allowed a lot of people using the software of their choice to get messages into Twitter. And then because they had so many opportunities for users to join. Their user base was growing, in unprecedented sizes, and the messages that were going through, no one had really built a system that would handle those before, which was why their uptime was so bad, because they would always crash their servers. But that also meant they had to focus a lot of their effort on the back end to develop whole new technologies to handle this traffic. And so they ended up developing a really robust back end, a lot of custom technology that allowed them to keep growing. And so at the end of the story, which may be obvious to you, is that the service with the more customers ultimately won. And Twitter, having more customers, was the place that had critical mass. That was the place where people wanted to go to send messages because that's where everyone else was. They wanted to send messages at a place where they would be read and where they could connect to more people who would then read their messages. So that's a long way of saying that sometimes the visual design or the number of features, in other words, like the performance of the product, isn't necessarily as important as other factors which influence the customer's experience but may not do so on a surface level like visual design. So why did this happen? So looking deeply into it, one clue in this case, I think, is Pownce's positioning. So here's a quote from one of the founders. She said, "When we launched the site and were compared to Twitter, it was shocking because Pownce is definitely a very different type of a site, a different type of feel, a different type of community." So they kept reiterating this message to the press and made it clear that, in their opinion, they were a different product. They had all these features, a rich design. They're really trying to target a special kind of person, a special kind of use. And so they felt they were positioned differently than Twitter. But what you would see reading the press and reading even just personal reviews from people on blogs is that they would inevitably be compared to Twitter. This was a new concept for us, microblogging. And when you look at Pownce, and let me go back to that screenshot of Pownce for a minute, you can see the focus of the screen, the top middle, is a place where you write your message, which we generally call tweets now. And then below that is a stream of messages. And so the focus really was on the microblog. And so people tended to lump them together with Twitter and think of them as competitors. And because we only have so many minutes in the day, it's hard to use a lot of different microblogging sites. Really, you end up honing in on one that seems most valuable. And so people ended up going to Twitter because that's where the critical mass was. So something that I felt looking at this was that although they felt their positioning was very different than Twitter, ultimately I think, like beauty, positioning is in the eye of the beholder. It's really in our audience's opinion of how we're actually positioned. We may tell them we're different, but ultimately they decide if we're really different or not. Which is another way of saying design is different than experience. What we design and our intentions behind the design is different than how people experience it. So having spent a couple years researching many products, I wrote about 10 of them in the book, but there are a lot of things I kind of went down a path of researching a product, and it didn't turn out, I think, really as good enough for the book. But I saw a pattern running across everything I researched, where companies had some degree of either ignorance or denial or sometimes even hubris of really kind of denying what they had to do to avoid failure. And I don't mean to kind of put thoughts or words into the mouths of the people who worked at these companies, because I think, and I dedicated my book to them, I think all of them are working very hard to try to be innovative and to give us something great in the world. But I think there were times, and sometimes they explicitly reveal these in their press releases or in their blog posts, where they did know what might not be right with the product or what might not resonate with customers, and failed to address that. Or sometimes it really is sort of outright hubris, which is the case with, for example, I have a case study on BMW's iDrive, which is their in-car navigation and control system. And overwhelmingly from the press and customers, people would complain about this, and BMW would just keep reiterating that this was a great system and would refuse to acknowledge any problems at all, but even while they were furiously working to fix things within BMW. So moving on, how do we avoid failure? So I think a big part of the solution is lean methods. If you're not familiar with these, let me just give you a 60-second primer. So there's a lot of different methods that are like this, that all sort of based on the same principles. The most popular one is called Lean Startup by Eric Rice. And he had a book that came out a couple years ago that really helped bring together a lot of concepts that people have been talking about really for decades or even for a century. You can trace these ideas back a long time. But he managed to bring them together in a way that really resonated with people at a time that I think people were ready to hear this message. And that was, you're familiar with agile development and how that doesn't try to predict the future, but takes a problem, codes things very quickly, and tests the code to see if it works. And you may be familiar with user-centered design, which kind of does the same thing from a design perspective. You have an idea of what may work, you build a prototype, you do user testing, and you learn from that. So they're iterative processes of testing. And what Lean does is try to bring that even further forward to the point where even when you have a business idea, that you could prototype that idea and test it and learn from that test and keep iterating that way to address all your big points of uncertainty. So these methods are largely based and can boil down to the scientific method that a lot of us learned back in school. And essentially you can describe it as these 4 points. That you start by making an observation, something that you notice something in the world, or maybe about your product or customer feedback you have, and then you form a hypothesis, which is essentially just an educated guess. It's like an if-then statement that if we changed this about our product, then this should happen. If we made our buy button orange, then sales will go up. And then you can run an experiment, making your button orange, and then interpret your results. So it's very simple, and the beauty of it is that it can be applied in so many different ways. And I think it helps us address a lot of the psychological issues that go on in organizations around product decisions, because there's a lot of psychological bias that can happen sometimes, but where we base decisions on our opinions or something we read someone else is doing, or things that may not be completely valid reasons to make a change. And by using something like Lean Startup or other scientific method-based approaches, we start to base our decisions based on data, right, that can be validated. So just an example of where I think I can add to this method a little bit is step number 2, where you form a hypothesis. So let me give you an example of a hypothesis. In the case of something like Pownce, which I just told you the story of, our hypothesis might be, if we add group features to microblogging, then we will be sufficiently different than Twitter so that within 1 month, at least 30% of our Twitter customers will use Pownce instead of or in addition to Twitter. So the idea here is that Pownce's group features were one thing that were very different than Twitter, and they felt could really differentiate them. This is something that could be used by a group of friends or your team or your department or your company to just communicate internally. And so this is part of what they're really counting on to be a success. This hypothesis states that they'd like 30% of Twitter customers. Twitter at that point was already much bigger than them, and the 30% number is something that just can come out of an organizational process. So you might make a business decision like, Twitter has 5 million customers, and if we had just 30% of that, and 10% of those were paying customers, that would be enough money for us to run the business. So that's where you might come up with a number like 30%. And then you can go and test this. And that's important when we're thinking of hypotheses, is that they're testable. And I'll show a more specific example of this a bit later. So when I was learning about Lean Startup, I went to a workshop and I read some books. And one of my questions was, where do these hypotheses come from? So when I was at the workshop, they said it's really a gut feeling. You should know, as the person in charge of the product, where the most risk is. What's the things that are most important that feel the most uncertain? And those are the things you should test. So that makes sense, and I do that sometimes, but it didn't seem like a sufficient answer. For something that bills itself as a scientific method, I wanted something more scientific. So I did some reading on the topic. Something else I heard was you should bring in smart advisors, which again I think is also good advice, to bring in people who have experience or expertise in having done the thing you're about to do, to give you advice from their experience. So this is also a good place to go, but again I didn't feel like it was really sufficient for me. So the thing I have, looking back at all the case studies I wrote, to add to this is patterns of failure. I felt, looking at the failures I had looked at closely, I could start to see a few patterns that could be boiled down to quick questions we could ask for our own projects, just to avoid failure in our work. So these patterns of failure, what I'm referring to is the UX muscle. So here are the 4 patterns. 1 is competitive advantage. 2 is technical advantage. 3 is competitive weakness. And 4 is the source of innovation. And I'll take you through each one of these, starting with competitive advantage. So competitive advantage, I explain that if you're in the point of view of someone who's testing your product, you might say we believe we have a particular competitive advantage, and that our customers' experiences are somehow better or different with our product. And so we really should ask, do customers actually experience this difference? And this is, using words like competitive advantages, harking back to business ideas of people like Michael Porter, who said, businesses essentially have some kind of competitive advantage, whether it's a lower price or more features, or they're differentiated somehow from their competition. And not all products are trying to give you a better experience, but I think as more products are infused with software and start to become more and more digital, I think this is going to start to apply to them more and more, that they will start to use design to differentiate themselves based on the experience. So in the case of Pownce, they were trying to differentiate themselves based on their position and the experience they would give customers. So we can set this up as write a hypothesis that would let us test if we actually have this competitive advantage, if we're actually giving people a better or a different experience the way we think we are. So I've already mentioned the hypothesis to you, and the way that we might test something like this in the lean startup way, for example, is that you might seed groups of customers who already use Twitter with a beta version of Pownce. And then wait a while, maybe a month or two, and then measure, do 30% of them, have they switched to Pownce, or are they using Pownce and Twitter? Because that's ultimately what Pownce wanted. They either felt like their product was different enough to Twitter that it could replace it, because you could broadcast to everyone or to just groups. So it's kind of a superset of Twitter. Or maybe people had reasons for using Twitter as well, because they were reaching people who weren't on Pownce. so that's probably just fine with Pownce if their customers were also using Twitter, just as long as they were using Pownce and paying for it. So we saw that, in their opinion, they explicitly thought they were different. And if they weren't sure of this, if they thought this hypothesis was more important than some other things they had on their plate, you can actually go out and test this. I should mention that there's a lot of different ways of measuring a customer's experience, not just this kind of method, but Lean Startup often uses this buying behavior as a proxy for experience. So Lean often talks about asking the potential customer to pay you some kind of currency that indicates that they're interested, that they think they would have a good experience, or that what you've given them is giving them a good experience. With the idea that if they pay for it, then they must like it, and they must be having a good experience. So there are a lot of other ways of measuring, say, emotions or actions, whatnot, but Lean takes this buying behavior as just a really quick way of trying to indicate that behavior. And that currency can be a lot of different things. It can be actual money, but it might be that people are devoting their time to using the product, or that they volunteer personal information to you in exchange for using the product. So the currency can take different forms, but it's all an indicator that they are having a good experience. So let me talk about the next pattern, which is technical advantage. Here, do our customers' experiences rely on technology performing in a new or better way? And if so, how could that impact the customer's experience? So for example, another case study I have in the book is about Symbian, which is an operating system now mostly maintained. Well, I can't even say that because it's been outsourced at this point. It was mostly run by Nokia and a consortium of other companies, and it was a mobile operating system. And it was at one time, not too long ago, it was the most popular operating system in the world. Just counting the number of phones in people's possession, more phones were running Symbian than any other operating system. And at the point where phones were becoming smartphones and smartphones were starting to use touch screens, Nokia made some interesting decisions that differed from, say, Apple and Google. They rolled out touch screens. They decided to use a different technology so that you had to use a pen for the screen, and the pen was very accurate, but you couldn't quite do the same kind of gestures you could with fingers. They also decided to keep building on top of Symbian and to continue using that operating system because there's so much backwards compatibility with millions of customers who were familiar with the operating system, with lots of apps that were running for it. And so there's this whole ecosystem around the operating system that they wanted to keep supporting. But what happened with the phones is that they didn't perform very well. They tried to layer touchscreen user interface elements on top of an operating system that just wasn't designed to be a touchscreen. And so things sort of worked, but sort of didn't. Some things required one tap, some things required two taps. You never really knew which was which. And the devices tended to be slow because there was just this big operating system the smartphone was trying to run that had a lot of code from being built up over years and years. Whereas other companies like Apple and Google were starting from scratch, and so they built their operating system specifically to be used with touchscreens. They didn't have a lot of crud from the past to include. They could really start fresh and have lean, fast-running code. So this was sort of this device, the 5800, was their first touchscreen phone. It was sort of the beginning of the end for them. They managed to improve it little by little over time, but never really were able able to compete. By the time their Symbian phones were of equal quality, they just lost so much market share. It was hard to claw their way back, and they ended up discontinuing Symbian and adopting the Windows Phone operating system. But at the time, you could, if you're in that position where your whole competitive advantage is resting on some kind of technology advantage, you might ask a question like, if we make touchscreen modifications to Symbian S60, then 75% of current customers will continue to buy our phones instead of our competitors' phones. So again, this 75% comes from some business decision like acknowledging that the iPhone and Android phones are new and exciting, and they're going to cut into our market share somewhat, but our device is good enough that our huge installed base of customers will continue to be loyal and think our phones are good enough to continue upgrading within our company. And you might test this by, say, identifying existing Nokia customers who are ready to upgrade to a new mobile phone and loan them both a Nokia phone and either an iPhone or Android phone for, say, a month or two, and then offer to let them keep one of them. And that really forces the decision from the person's point of view, which one am I having a better experience with, because I don't want to lose that. And then you can ask yourself, did 75% at least choose the Nokia phone? So this is really kind of a cold water test that forces you to test the implicit assumptions, either implicit or explicit assumptions that you're having when you're making design decisions. The third pattern I'd like to cover is competitive weakness. So if you're in the situation, you could ask, based on our observation, testing, and customer feedback, where are the customer experience flaws that competitors might address? So this is best explained through an example. One case study I have in the book is about Wesabe, which was an online personal financial management site that existed between, I guess, 2006 and 2010. And when it came out in 2006, it was really innovative and really useful to a lot of people. It allowed you to aggregate a lot of your financial accounts, like your bank account, a brokerage account, a retirement account, all in one place, so you could see where the money was coming from, where the money was going, and do some analysis on that. And then it had a lot of community features built into it. So when you had a question about how to save more money or how to manage your finances better, you could go to the community and ask them. And it was a really robust, enthusiastic community of people who wanted to solve their problems and help other people solve their problems. And so this was just a really great, useful product for a long time. Unfortunately, there was one difficult thing about it, which was to aggregate all your bank accounts. You had to go to each financial institution's website to, say, your bank and export your activity for a certain time period and be very careful about the time period that matched what you had already exported last time. And then you would get something like a comma-separated file and then upload that to Wesabe. And then Wesabe would do its, and import that and analyze it for you. And you have to do that for each one of the financial institutions. So once you got the data into Wesabe, it was great, but getting it in there was a laborious process. At some point, Mint.com came along and made that much easier. What they did is just accepted your name and password for any financial institution, and then just would periodically go and export that information for you and import it into the system. And then they would give you some really beautiful charts and graphs to look at that would help you analyze where the money was going. So in many ways, again, kind of going back to the death of the spec, Mint did not have a lot of what Wesabe offered. It didn't have that whole community. It didn't have a lot of the analysis tools that Wesabe had built over the period of years. But they focus on this one particular part of the problem, and this kind of comes out of a different philosophy of what people wanted to do. Wesabe felt that people wanted more control over their finances, were willing to do a little bit of work to do that, and benefited from that. And they also felt that there was a more secure method to manage your finances rather than giving your name and passwords to an online system. And for some people, both of those reasons may have been completely true and valid. But when Mint came along, they found that a lot more people were interested in just making it as easy as possible. So in the case of managing this financial information online, there were a lot more people who just wanted to put the account information in and then benefit from everything that the site offered. So in the case of Wesabe, they had a hypothesis, and in a blog post that one of the founders really generously wrote after they had closed down, he revealed that they had really explicitly considered making this financial information importing an automatic feature at some point, and had, for a variety of very good reasons, had decided not to. But having raised that question to themselves, they already had the hypothesis there, and so it's something they could have tested. And so the hypothesis might be something like, if customers have a choice between automatically importing their data or a manual method, then at least 60% will choose the manual method for the control and the security it affords. So you are kind of looking to the future and say, well, we're considering this, we're deciding not to do this automatic importing approach, but someone else might. And so maybe we should test this just in case somebody else does it and doesn't kind of steal our market share. And so you might test it by, just doing this, in a kind of a baby step way. You might prototype a system with automatic data import for just one financial institution, so something very large like a Citibank or Wells Fargo, and then test it with a control group for a period and offer them the chance to switch back. Do they prefer the really kind of easy method, or do they want to go back to something they felt more secure about that gave them more control? The last pattern I'd like to cover is source of innovation. So this might be the most obvious when it comes to forming a hypothesis, because this is a lot of what the lean startup method focuses on. Innovation, it's a term that's thrown around a lot, so I'd like to just try to define it simply as something new that succeeds in the marketplace. And if we're designing something, if we're doing something new, it's by definition it's going to be different than what's been done before, and therefore there's some risk involved, and that can lead to failure. So that's a good place to start with testing things. So as an example of that, I'll talk about Plaxo, another case study from the book. So Plaxo is still a service that's around today. When it launched, it was a service to basically manage your contact information online. And the, I'd say, innovative way they did this was by sending messages to everyone in your contact book, your address book, and asking them to update your information for you. So these update requests look like this. So they would ask you to, as a recipient of this, to go online and update your information. So number one, this was a very different kind of behavior they were asking you to engage in. Normally we all update our own address books, and they were asking their friends and family and other contacts to update their address book. Additionally, Plaxo couldn't really share that information among all their customers. They might be able to say, well, customer A has Victor Lombardi in their address book, and customer B also has Victor Lombardi in their address books, and the phone numbers match, so that must be the same Victor Lombardi. And so we don't really need to update that information from him more than once. We can just share it across customers. That would have been sketchy from a privacy standpoint. So all of my contacts that had me in their address book would send me this update request. So it wasn't uncommon for us back in the days when this was popular to receive 100 of these, something from all of our friends. And it was becoming a real problem from the point of view of non-customers. And it was getting to the point where non-customers were so angry about it, it was starting to affect the public relations perspective of Plaxo. So there's a long, really interesting story about what was happening internally at Plaxo during this time, but we might boil that down to this hypothesis that they eventually asked, which was if we greatly increase the volume of update request emails, fewer of 20% of non-customers will complain. So if they really didn't think the update request emails were a problem, they could have done a test to validate that hypothesis. So a test you might do to do this is, say if we increase the volume of update request emails sent from a small subset of customer accounts and enable the non-customer recipients to send a complaint from a link in that emails, do less than 20% complain. So again, this is just one way you could test this, just one way you could form the hypotheses. But this is something that they waited a long, long time to do and got to the point where they were getting bashed in the media, and they felt could affect their future growth prospects as well as their business prospects, because they were a startup and were hoping to move much further. So I think I'm running out of time here, so I just wanted to move on to our summary and see if there's any questions for me. So in summary, if you're losing lean or even a similar process where you're trying to mitigate risk in a new design, you're creating these hypotheses, you can just boil this down to these 4 questions to ask yourself to see if these patterns of failure might apply to your project. So before I'm going to go any further, I'd like to thank you all again for taking time to spend with me today. And I wanted to ask Yasmina if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Victor. Yes, we have several questions that have come in. And folks, as you can tell, we are at Q&A now. So please, if you do have a question for Victor and what he's been talking to you about, open your group chat widget, type it in, send it in, and we'll take as many as we have time for. All right, Victor, we'll take them in the order they came in. And Andre would like to know, what is your hypothesis about why Pownce failed?
So it's I should say I'm not really doing complete justice to any of these products in this presentation, because they are, very rich, complex situations. People are working for years on products. There's lots of decisions, lots of good reasons why they do things. In the case of Pownce, what I say in the book is, is not just about the success of Twitter going after critical mass versus Pownce not attracting as many customers. It does get more complicated than that. For example, the business model also played a role. Pownce allowed you to send attachments, and if you bought a membership at a pro level, you could send very large attachments. So that was a bet on their part that people wanted this feature, but also that by bringing some revenue in from customers early, it made them a more sustainable business, which was also an interesting hypothesis on their part, and might have worked out, if the competitive situation was different. Whereas Twitter stayed free for a long time and attracted venture capital investment, a lot of it. So they were able to build this huge back end. And so that also played a role in how they were able to grow and survive over time. So there's a lot of different factors, and in the book I tried to pick out case studies where I thought the customer experience was the deciding factor. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. We have a question from Dan who asks, how do they come up with 30%, 75%, 60% in the hypothesis examples? I suspect those are thresholds needed to justify their business decisions, like implementation costs, and not based on previous tests. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, great question. So I agree, yes, they are based on business decisions, but they might also be based on previous tests. So that decision that percentage might equate to a dollar figure that is expected as a return of the investment you're making in that change. We're investing a certain amount of money to make this product or to roll out this new feature, and we expect it to have at least this much return. And again, you could take a financial approach to this, or you could even just say, we're making enough money. We just want to make sure the product is better, and so we just want to make sure people are much happier. You might measure that, using an index of like customer satisfaction, for example. But over time, if you keep asking these and keep testing them, because methods like Lean Startup are very iterative, you do start to build up a base of experience with this and a bunch of data on what you've done before and what the results were. So you should be able to fine-tune that percentage over time. So it's a little bit more of a educated guess and more of a kind of a precise estimation based on what the past test showed. So I would say it's both.
Great, thank you, Victor. A couple more questions coming in here. Next question here from Murray Chris. I hope I'm saying your name right. He asks, or she asks, do you think that changing business models could actually lead to higher success rates rather than redesigning your site, which could make moving into a better UI experience difficult?
I'd say yes, it's definitely possible. It's a kind of a huge question because it depends on so many things. But that's a lot of what is covered, say, in the Lean Startup book, is what's known as the pivot. That you can, there's a number of different kinds of pivot. You could just pivot on the design level if you think the design is the problem, or if you think the business model is the problem, you could change that. And again, you can test those things before you make the pivot. So yeah, it's a big question. It's kind of complicated, but if you're interested in diving into those things, I recommend the Lean Startup book very much.
Great, thank you. Rick would like to know, he says, I'm not clear how the patterns translate into concrete questions. Could you explain that, please?
Sure. Let me jump back into one. So for something like competitive advantage, if you think from a design perspective, you're doing things that should give people a better experience, you want to go and test whether people actually have this better experience. So that's the question in a nutshell. It may seem, I don't know if that's confusing or oversimplifying, but I think it's something that, in my experience, a lot of organizations have implicitly, or they might talk about internally, but then never actually go and test to validate whether their, let's say their positioning is different than their customers, and customers feel like it's a different product, or if a feature they're rolling out is experienced that much different. They might see whether that feature works and whether their customers like the feature, but not necessarily go to the point of making sure it's better than the competition. And that's another theme I think I found throughout the book, is that companies often fail not just because of what they were doing, but because of what the competition was doing was better. So in the case of like Wesabe or Pownce, for example, they had pretty good products and were making their customers happy until the competition came along and made the customers much happier. And so that's why I think like asking this question, for example, is so important. And so if you missed them all, by the way, I believe you can download this presentation from O'Reilly. Is that right, Yasmina?
Yes, folks, you have a green file folder widget in your widget tray. Click on it, and you can download a copy of the slides right there.
Right. So if you missed the question, you can just go back into the slide and dig it out.
And we will also have the archive of today's event ready within 48 hours, and we will send you all an email with access details so you can listen to the event again. All right, Victor, a couple more questions here. Let's see. Roman asks, could you please repeat what the question is to ask yourself that goes along with technical advantage?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not a master of this presentation software just yet. So for technical advantage, the question is, do our customers' experiences rely on technology performing in a new or better way? So I was illustrating this with the Nokia. And again, it's on the surface, it's kind of a simplistic question, but we might be rolling out new technology and then focused on the design, but sometimes the design itself is fine. But like one criticism of Symbian is that the processors just of the time just weren't fast enough to run that operating system. So sometimes you would tap something and then have to wait a second or two before the phone responded. And touchscreens really rely on the fact that everything is going to respond within, say, a millisecond or 2 milliseconds, because anything longer than that, and you just feel like the device isn't working. And so if it takes a second or two, it really feels like it's broken. So we know this from usability research. And so they're basically using old technology to perform in this new way, the Symbian operating system to power a touchscreen device. And so that's the question that came out of that pattern I found. So I hope that helps.
Perfect. And we'll take the final question here from Matthew, who says, what would you do for a Klondike bar? How do you find out what your customers would or wouldn't do?
How do you find out what your customers would and wouldn't do? Well, there's lots of different ways to do that. The ideal way is to simulate the actual conditions of your product. If you can actually get them to go through an experience where they would buy and use your product the same way they would once it was launched or after you've finished all your work, that's ideal. And so, working backwards from that, I think about what elements of those experience are the most important for us to test. And let's try to simulate that experience as much as possible without having built the whole product to see if they'll use it or not. So, and that sort of gets back to how do you form a hypothesis, and that's where I end up going through all my research to come up with these questions. Because there's only so many hours in the day, and you can't test everything, and so I use these to try to focus myself on the questions to ask that are most important, that are going to help you avoid failure.
All right. And with that, folks, we are going to say a very big thank you to you, Victor, for presenting a really outstanding and fascinating webcast for us all today and for sharing all your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you, Yasmina. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Folks, we'd like to remind you on your screen right there is Victor's new book, Why We Fail, from Rosenfeld Media. We do have some special offers for you as a thank you for attending today's event. We pushed them out to you in the group chat. Plus, as you can see, it's right there on your screen. If you'd like the ebook version, O'Reilly has a special today. You can get it for 50% off. And if you'd like the print version, please visit the website we pushed out to Rosenfeld Media there, or just follow that bit.ly URL. You can save 20%. That book has so much great information that can really help you with your day-to-day. So we do invite you all to take advantage of those specials and pick up the book today. Again, we thank you, Victor. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This will conclude today's webcast. Goodbye, everybody.